Okay, welcome to Chapter 9. Chapter 9 is about security technology, so basically the toys. And we're talking specifically this time about intrusion detection like a burglar alarm. Okay, so page 337, learning objectives. Describe the categories of intrusion detection systems. Describe the approaches that you would use. And then we talk a little bit about honeypots, things of that nature. But the major category of scanning tools, the things that you use to determine whether or not you're vulnerable. Okay, so the opening case is kind of weird. Talk about, a fired employee and he's using a radius server and he's trying to work out a back door and, he's kind of getting thwarted and it's like, yeah, okay. So let's just start from the very beginning, page 338, the introduction. So remember when we said, use management controls over technical controls, right? Like try to solve a problem with, a policy if you can. And then tools are handy, but they're not always a solution. Well, this chapter is the exact opposite. We're saying, okay, we're done with policy now. Let's buy something, let's put it in place and get the thing going. So an intrusion is more than just gaining access. I mean, we still use the term, but a virus or a worm or a denial of service. I mean, those aren't intrusions necessarily, but they're stuff that affects you. And so detection is all about identifying this particular threat. Now, they're using the term threat here, but okay, vulnerability and threat, and hopefully doing something about it. So it's just like a smoke alarm in your house or a burglar alarm if you have one of those. I mean, it's the same thing. The thing goes off when something's going wrong and you have to have a human to kind of intervene to find out if it's real. So, these intrusion detection systems have been around for quite some time. I mean, it's just as long as burglar systems have been around. Now, unlike a normal household burglar alarm, it could be a silent alarm like you have at a bank. Somebody's trying to hold up the bank, you press the little button and it just does a silent alarm, right? Doesn't have to be something noisy. Anyway, they're now called intrusion detection and prevention systems because we're not talking about just detecting the fire, using that example. We're talking about preventing the fire. So those, if you're going to throw in the prevention, you're really taking the human out of the loop. You can't have human intervention, otherwise it won't happen in real time. So some of the things we're talking about is somebody's connecting to our system and they're doing something and they determine that it's bad, it's an intrusion of some sort. Well, then just drop the connection, right? So you're doing something about it. Blocking access, turning on other controls. Maybe you have a knob, so to speak, that controls like your firewall. And, normally you set it at this, but if there's some sort of event going on, you could ratchet it up so it shuts down our major services and only lets the essential ones through. So prevention, again, requires, something smart enough to be able to do something about it, not just talk about it. Okay, terminology on page 339. So an alert, that's kind of obvious. Some sort of an alarm goes off, right? No big deal. Alarm clustering. So here's the thing. Let's say, for example, if there was a smoke alarm, it went off. Okay, I'm changing the subject. Let's say you're in a hotel and all the rooms have smoke detectors because you're not supposed to smoke in the room. But the smoke alarm goes off and then it goes off again and again and again and again. It's sort of like, I know, I got it. Okay, I'm on my way up there now. There's no need for me to get 10 alarms on the same thing. One would be sufficient. So clustering them basically means wrapping them up, and so I don't get a flood of things coming in. I don't want 10 alarms in 60 seconds when one would do. Okay, alarm filtering, typically this would be like by severity. So you have an alarm that says, somebody's at the door. Well, is that cause for concern? Maybe, maybe not. So that's kind of a low thing. They're rattling the doorknob. Well, okay, that's a little bit more. They whooped out a sledgehammer. Okay, now we're, that kind of stuff. You could get some false positives here, right? You could be running off to, call the police when there's nothing going on. Okay. A confidence value. So, as an example, a product might say, we respond to, distributed denial of service, 90% of the time, that kind of stuff. It's some sort of a claim that, I'm fairly confident this device that we installed is going to do its job. Evasion. You don't want the device itself to be so incredibly obvious that people can look at it and go, I see you're using brand 123, model XYZ, and therefore I know exactly how to evade your detection. You've seen all the spy movies, like where there's cameras set up and somebody says, well, they must have known where the cameras were because, they snuck around the outside edge of the room where there was no camera coverage, like that kind of stuff. So if you can see the camera, then you can evade the camera. Okay. So a false attack stimulus. So basically it's used as a part of a response. In other words, you could test your alarm system to see if it works. I mean, it sounds kind of silly, but when you install an alarm system with glass break, they have this little doodad that they carry with them. It has a speaker, and they hit the button and it puts off this god awful horrible sound that sounds like breaking glass, and it sets the alarm. So that kind of stuff. A false negative, that just makes sense, right? We know it, but false negative is I failed to detect a real attack. A false positive is I responded to something that was not an attack. Okay. So noise. So here's the thing. You could get so overwhelmed if you didn't have any filtering by categories or importance. You could get so overwhelmed by the just sheer volume of chatter that when something does pop up on the screen, it's like, yeah, and you just kind of ignore it. So yet another movie reference. So I told you guys, you don't have to be a movie buff to be able to do well in this class. But this is a really cool movie. And basically the story behind it that makes it interesting and relevant is they're trying to break into this museum and have a state-of-the-art system going, and there's no way they can overcome it. So what they do is they hide inside the museum, like in a little broom closet, and then set off the alarm, and they go hide. And the alarms go off, and the police come, and they can't find anything. So they wait, and then they do it again. They set off the alarm, and they go hide. And so they all react again. Nobody comes, and the police comes, and they can't find anything. So they do it a third time. And so finally it gets to the point where they're going, look, we're not going to get any sleep tonight. Let's just turn the damn thing off. So they turn the burglar system off, and then they emerge from their hiding spot and steal the painting. So we're talking about overwhelming you with false positive. Well, in this case, it wasn't a false positive, but anyway, with false alerts drowning you out and just getting you so much noise that you really can't tell a real event from a bad event. Okay. So site policy, that just means, your rules and configuration. Site policy awareness, dynamically altering a response, right? Like, or I could just call what do you want me to do? Oh, you want me to drop this connection or tweak this recording stuff or tighten the firewall, or you just want me to call an admin and just let it go? Okay, we talked about this early on in Chapter 2. We talked about the target attack, where they were asleep at the wheel. A true attack stimulus, a real honest-to-God test, like you literally have somebody, open the doors and open the windows, that kind of stuff. And then tuning, because the sensitivity levels, and the story I like to talk about was this really strange scenario, and I may have some of the details wrong, but there was construction going on at the Army base, and it had an awful lot of vibration, and there was a secure facility that was right next door underground, well, in the basement, and it was setting off their little tremble detector, because that's how you would detect if somebody was tunneling in. And so they had to change the sensitivity of the temporarily change the sensitivity of that device. Okay, why use an IDS? Page 340. Well, it kind of makes sense. It's for detection and and for documentation, because I can tell when something's going on. In other words, if somebody says, well, dang it, how many times do we get attacked? And you go, well, it was 147 times last month. You actually have some real data. So if you try to defend yourself like trying to get money, you have real things. We were successfully deterred, this, that, and the other. And then, of course, deterrence. If they kind of sort of know that you have, a good system, then they'll probably say, well, screw that. I'm going to go attack this other organization because they do not have an IDS. Okay. So the first part is the intrusion detection. So the primary purpose, of course, is to identify and report issues. So an attack reconnaissance. Now this is not, I'm poking at the seams trying to find out if I want to come back and do something nasty. So this first attempt is me just looking around, wandering around the perimeter, looking at the gates, looking at the windows, that kind of stuff. So an early stage of an attack before a real attack occurs. It could be what's called doorknob rattling, where, the guard, would walk down the hall and check to see if all the doors were locked, that kind of stuff. Or footprinting. So I go on the web and I find everything there is to know about the company and maybe even, what vendors they use, that kind of stuff. And then fingerprinting is about, setting up something maybe from the outside, maybe from the inside, that goes and tells me, where all the machines are, what their machine names are, what operating system you're running. So I'm gathering, I haven't attacked yet, but I'm gathering tons and tons of information. If I was able to tell which machines in the organization have the latest patch and which do not, well, then I'll direct an attack against the unpatched servers. Okay, make sense? And then, of course, known vulnerabilities, 0-day vulnerabilities, and, so the speed of the update is obviously very important. So intrusion detections can detect things that are not well known. In other words, I don't know what this is, but it doesn't sound right to me, so I'm going to turn it off, that kind of thing. It could be not a real attack. It could be a reconnaissance run. So can an intrusion detection system even detect whether or not a reconnaissance is going on? Well, if you're using something like Nmap, well, then the answer is yes. Nmap is one of those network scanning tools. Yes, your IDS can definitely tell that someone, typically on the inside, is running that. I mean, inside doesn't mean, you're an employee. You could be, somebody walks in into the lobby and there's a machine there in the lobby. And so you stick a thumb drive in and fire up, and scan the network from the lobby. You don't have to have an account or anything. And then data collection. That makes sense because I'm recording a lot of data. There could be like a normal level that I record, and then under a attack scenario, I crank up the details that I want. And so I can use this to set like a baseline. Here's how many things are actually happening. Here's what we normally get. And you can get attack frequencies from this if you let it run for a while. And then during an attack, you crank up the amount of data you're collecting so you know who, what, when, where, and why. Okay, so a review of the data is still very important regardless of whether the IDS was able to deter it or prevent it or stop it, right? The collection of data, I go, okay, I'm getting hit by this organization from North Korea, that kind of stuff. And then attack deterrence. Now, this is kind of a funny one because, you know how in homes around the place, you have these little stickers on the wall or on the windows and stuff. By the way, you can buy these stickers from Amazon. You don't actually have to have, an ADT system. You just buy a sticker that looks like an ADT sticker and put them on your windows, and everybody's going, oh, well, I'm gonna go to this other house because obviously they have that. So it's a deterrent. Whether or not it's real, you don't even have to have the system. You just have to show that it looks like you have a system. Okay, we're coming up on the 15-minute mark.